Hi, I'm Jerry Boyer. Welcome to Meeting of Minds podcast. Thank you very much for listening to us today and for joining us. And I'm extremely excited about this interview, which I've been looking forward to for some time. We're speaking with N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright probably needs no introduction to anyone who has listened to any of the podcasts I've done or radio shows over the year. He's maybe the most prominent and influential New Testament scholar of our generation. He is the author of a trilogy about the New Testament and the people of God. He's the author of the series, it's back behind us for those who are watching by video, the For Everyone series. He's delivered the prestigious Gifford Lectures. He's associated with Wycliffe Hall, and he has a new, I believe this is his first actual full-length book of the Bible commentary, Galatians. N.T. Wright, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's nearly true. My commentary on Romans is actually quite long, but it comes within the New Interpreter's Bible. It's in volume 10 of the massive series, the New Interpreter's Bible. That came out, nearly 20 years ago now. But this is the first standalone single volume commentary. The Romans one, as I say, it is quite a long commentary because the NIB, the New Interpreter's Bible, is a big, massive series, but it comes in the same volume as Acts and First Corinthians.
And this is part of a series as well, but not in the middle of a long series.
No, this is supposedly so they tell me, the flagship for the new series which Eerdmans is launching. This is Commentaries for Christian Formation, and they wanted me to do the first one in the series and to make it on Galatians.
Got it. And now I've Kindled this one, so we can see it's also available on Kindle. But feel free to hold it up as well. So, was Christian formation a force fit for your Galatians commentary? In other words, we're doing a series on Christian formation. Can you make it work, Tom? Or is it...
Grace and peace, everybody. Elders working on a house. He said, I want to show you something. He went to the van and pulled a book out. Where Rev C at? He's in here. Good to see you, cross-examine. What's good, Covey? Look, N.T. Wright, Commentary for Christian Formation on the book of Galatians. Let me see this page that he highlighted here. He said he bought this book a few years back. Page 114. Listen to this, most excellent. Gentile Jewish followers of Jesus could stay as Gentiles, and Jewish Jesus followers can continue their traditional Jewish practices. I'm going to pull this up and I'm going to do a little bit of reading. Fair use.
More like, no, finally, we're catching up with Paul in that Christian formation is actually a central theme in books like Galatians.
Well, yes, I think I've had it easy. In fact, Eerdmans and I have been talking about a commentary on Galatians for quite a long time, but finally they said just a couple of years ago, listen, we've got this new series. We want this to be the number one. What do you think about doing it? And I scratched my head and we discussed it a little bit.
And the title is
editorial team. And the more I thought about it, the more actually it is a perfect fit for Galatians, much more so perhaps than, more obviously so than for many New Testament books, because Galatians is where Paul says, my little children with whom I'm in labor pains again.
Yes.
Somebody, I'm looking for a few people. Covey's already in here. Somebody found Leo. Somebody call Elder Joe, and I'll hit Jay the producer. He around somewhere. Let me see who else we need in here. Fair use.
Till the Messiah be formed in you. So it is actually a natural fit. So I didn't have to try hard to make this work. It just kind of fell out naturally.
Yes, and I think that's literally Christian Messiah in formation, right?
Exactly.
Paul is bringing birth to the Messiah in the form of birthing a Christian community, which is pretty weird imagery for your standard Christian conversation. There's a lot in Galatians that's like, if it weren't in Galatians and someone stood up in the pulpit and said this stuff, people would be picking up pitchforks.
I think that may be true, and it may well be true if people actually take...
He said some of this stuff right here, folk in the church will be picking up pitchforks. One thing I can say is y'all say what y'all want about my man, that ignorant elder. I know he get it on with Dunamis, but dispensational Tim, I believe he was the first one to bring up N.T. Wright and said, nope, N.T. Wright's been arguing for a little while that maybe we need to relook some of this stuff. Let me keep going. Shout dispensational Tim.
Seriously some of the points that I've been arguing in the commentary about what's actually going on in Galatians, because it's totally unlike, as you'll know if you've read it, totally unlike the normal post-Reformation commentary, which is all about how I get saved and do I have to do good works to go to heaven and so on, which actually isn't what Galatians is about at all. So I'm waiting for the bricks to start flying when reviewers get their teeth into it.
Yes, I think.
Sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors there.
That's fine. Paul does that sometimes too. You're in good company.
Yeah, he does.
Yes, I expect the discernment bloggers, once they've had a chance to get through all 400 pages, to accuse you of bringing another gospel, as opposed to, even though you're explicating Paul's explication of the original gospel.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I think you're right. And perhaps you can let me know if you see any interesting reviews before I do.
I don't know if you want it. Sometimes I feel like when I read your writing, sometimes I can feel the pain between the lines of the anticipation of the blowback.
There is a bit of that. I mean, I'm old enough now not really to mind, though I still do mind, because naturally when you write a commentary on the Bible, what you're saying to people is, please, can you read.
All right, look at this. Let me read this right here. Let me see. Most Excellent said N.T. Wright is more in tune with what the early church taught actually. All right, fair use.
This book in this way, because I think if you do, you'll find that God has fresh light to break out of his holy word.
And you want the Messiah to be formed in them. You want the Messiah to be formed in yourself and in your detractors. I mean, if you're truly Pauline, that's another division, right? Paul's talking about all these divisions, right?
Yeah, and
Jew and
it
Gentile.
Just so happens, weirdly, in a way, that I was working on this at the time when, in a fresh way, because of the George Floyd business a year ago and so on, both America and Britain have been talking about the relationship between different ethnic or racial groups. And though that's a general social question, not a church question, it's very obvious that the churches on both sides of the Atlantic need to be faced with this question afresh. And since that is what Galatians is all about, well, maybe it might just help us to get our heads and our hearts into the right mode.
Maybe it's a social question with a church answer, or a potential church
absolutely.
answer. Yes.
I mean, the way I would put it is that the church from the beginning, from its first days certainly in Antioch, and actually even in Jerusalem, but certainly in Antioch, the church always was a multicultural, multi-ethnic, polychrome, multilingual organization. It's like in Revelation, a great company of many nations and kindreds and tribes and tongues, all together praising God and the Lamb. That's the vision of the church in the New Testament. And we, in the last 400 or 500 years, have colluded with division down ethnic lines without even realizing just how unbiblical we were being, because we'd taken our eye off that ball and were looking instead at theories of salvation about going to heaven, which Galatians isn't about.
Was there anything else like that in the ancient? The ancient world's probably a little too broad. We don't necessarily know what's going on in China or India, but in the oikumene, in the Roman world, is there anything else like that?
No, as far as we know, the answer is absolutely not. The closest you might get would be in the Roman army, which recruited soldiers from all over, from the provinces. But A, they would all be men. B, they would all be signed up to be Caesar loyalists, as it were. But there was a sort of a polychrome, multi-ethnic dimension to the Roman army. The Roman imperial civil service
devoted to death instead of life. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Exactly.
Right? Yes.
No, exactly. And so when Paul uses the imagery of military weapons and so on, as he does in Ephesians 6 or 1 Thessalonians 5, there is a kind of an echo across that, well, they're doing it like that, but of course we do it like this. But the other parallel, which you have to say, is that the synagogue communities embraced people right around the Mediterranean world, but of course they were all either Jews or proselytes. And that's exactly the point, that here you've got a community which includes Jews and Gentiles on equal terms, and men and women on equal terms. It's one of the things we often fail to note about the debate about circumcision, that only applies to males. That males wear the Jewish badge of membership, whereas baptism, which is a rough equivalent, not an exact equivalent, but a rough equivalent for Paul, is both male and female. And so there is, I hate to use the word inclusive because that word is so abused these days, but there is this sense of a welcome of all and sundry on the basis of the transformation which comes through baptism and faith. I, through the law, died to the law. I am crucified with the Messiah. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but the Messiah lives in me. That is then the same for everybody, whether they're Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free. Well, that's the heart of Galatians.
And let's talk about that passage. That's an important passage. There's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. And I think to some degree, it has been weaponized on the progressive side, kind of ignored on the conservative side, and weaponized on the progressive side, in the sense that all distinctions, we're all caught up in a kind of a monism of there never should have been distinctions. See, one of the things that's distinctive about your thought is you add temporality to it. So Galatians is often read as though there never should have been a distinction between Jew and Gentile. And I think your reading of Galatians is, yes, there should, but history has changed. We're in a new phase, so it's no longer an appropriate distinction.
Exactly. Otherwise, you look back at the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and you read a book like Ezra or Nehemiah, which is very clear about not mixing the Jews, not mixing with their pagan neighbors. Hey, we did that before and it got us into trouble, And so many people have looked back at that and said, oh, they were getting it wrong. And the answer is no, they were getting it right, because the Messiah had not yet come. They were still quite properly living under Torah. And we have to learn from Galatians 3, exactly as you say, the chronological sequence, that the Torah was given for an express purpose, which was a time-limited purpose. That's the thing that it's taken theologians such a difficult time to get their heads around, so that you have the Lutherans basically saying Moses knows nothing of Christ, and you have the Reformed or the Calvinists saying, oh no, it's all continuous, the law is fulfilled in Christ. And they both fail to see that the law is God's good law, but it was given for the time until the Messiah came. And understanding that, I hesitate to use the word dispensation, because that, of course, means a lot of different things, especially in
There's
North America.
landmines everywhere, aren't there?
Well, exactly. But one has to pick one's way through those landmines rather carefully. And when you do, basically, it makes sense. For me, the result of good exegesis is having summarized it all to say, now, if you read the text straight through, you'll see that every line just makes sense, and it means what it was meant to mean, rather than, oh, how much clearer it would have been if Paul had said X or Y.
If you read it, if you read it forward as a letter, if you go hunting, treating it as an armory,
quite, exactly. And of course, that's part of the irony here, is that people who've said the Bible have often actually treated the Bible simply as a ragbag that they can reach in and pull out a text and say, there you are, this is true for all time. And I want to say, sure, it's true for all time, but it's true in the form that God has given it to us, i.e. this specific letter of Paul to the churches in southern Turkey, probably dated 48, 49 AD. And that context is really, really important.
So you put this between the time when he has the confrontation with Peter in Antioch and then the later Council of Jerusalem in
Yes.
Acts when it's resolved, right? Okay.
Yes. Well, it's sort of resolved. I mean, they do a kind of a holding job, like a lot of church councils. They manage to keep people happy for the moment, and often that's the best you can do in a church council. He says, having suffered through church councils himself, that you have to say, okay, this is where we are at the moment. Let's hang on to one another and say our prayers and see where God is taking us forward now. And that's what they do. But yes, I've argued in my Paul biography and elsewhere that Galatians is early, and that, yes, it is written before the council, so that the meeting which Paul describes in Galatians 2, 1-10 is not a Pauline version of Acts 15. Actually, it doesn't fit. People try to make it fit, but it really doesn't. It is Paul's more detailed account of the meeting in Acts 11,
right,
where he and Barnabas go to Jerusalem with financial help because the church is in need because of the upcoming famine and so on.
I'm just looking at the passage. There's no longer Jew or Greek. That's interesting. It's not there is or has been. We could do a perfect tense. We could do an imperfect tense, but there is no longer Jew. I mean, I think we have a present tense, but with no longer. I don't have the Greek. Maybe that's a paraphrastic or something. But
well,
clearly something has changed. History has changed. It's not that Paul is revealing that there never should have been. It's that we're in a new time and it's not appropriate anymore.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And he says that very carefully when he's going through that the law was given to play a specific role. He calls it the pedagogos, which is a word for a male, like a babysitter almost, the one the slave who looks after the kid and makes sure the kid gets to school on time. He's not the one who teaches the child, the son, presumably.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that distinction.
Oh yeah. No, a pedagogos, and this then plays over into the other point that I'll make about it in a minute, perhaps. That a pedagogos is a slave, not a teacher, but the slave whose job it is to keep the kid by the earlobe and drag him to school, make sure he gets there without misbehaving, and then he hands him over to the real teacher.
I think the cognate threw me off. Pedagogy, right? So
exactly. But technically, pedagogos means leading the child. Now, of course, we have interpreted that in terms of education.
Yes.
But paida and then ago.
Right.
His job is to take the child to school, make sure he gets there. So
the Torah is a slave too, maybe. If maybe we're pushing the metaphor too much, but God is the teacher, or am I creating a conceit out of a metaphor?
No, that would be expanding it in a way that Paul doesn't.
Okay.
I think Paul would say, though, that Torah is God's good law given for a purpose. And that purpose is to get Israel to the point where the Messiah can come. And this is...
Is that what he's saying? That's what you're hearing? Sean, that's what you're hearing? I'm scared.
Paul, chapter 4, verse 4, when the fullness of time came, the pleroma tu chronou, God sent forth his son. And so the Torah is given to get Israel to the finishing line, as it were, or if you like, to the starting line, to the messianic point. And once that's happened, the job is done. I use the illustration, which I've used often in lecturing, and I think students find it helpful, of the space rocket, which needs a particular booster to get it out of orbit and into deep space. I'm not sure if Richard Branson used one of those the other day when he went up, but still, you have a booster rocket because without it, you're not going to get into deep space. You'll fall back again. But once you're out there, somebody back in base presses a button and the booster rocket falls away, not because it was a bad thing and we're happy to get rid of it, but because it was a good thing whose job is now done. And that's more or less exactly what Paul says about Torah.
I'm glad that you brought up the beginning of 4, because I'm looking at the end of 3, Galatians 3 and 4, and here I have my Kingdom New Testament. You have video, and you can see lines going back and forth, because I'm not really liking this chapter division. There's no longer Jew or Greek. There's no longer slave or free. There's no longer male and female. And then right after that, the heir is a child. He is no different from a slave. So here we have slave and free. And then we have born of a woman, right? Paul doesn't have to say born of a woman. He says born of a woman, born under the law. So I'm really thinking that this not an arbitrary list of all the distinctions Paul can think of off the top of his head, but rather distinctions that are relevant to the separation involved with the Torah. Right, the Messiah is going to be born of a woman, as Genesis 3 says. Circumcision reflects a division between the genders. The slave and free distinction is a Torah distinction because we're still enslaved. So the male and female, Jew or Greek, that these specific distinctions are done away with.
Yes,
not all distinctions we can think of. You see what I'm saying?
That's right. And we have to be careful in nuancing that as well. I was speaking at a conference some years ago where I was emphasizing chapter 3, verse 28, and there was an African-American woman theologian who was present who said, in a very nice way, she said, you need to know that when we hear somebody like you saying this stuff, it sounds as if you're saying, so you can all now become honorary white males. And I said, no, that's exactly what I'm not saying. But I said, but if that's what you're hearing, I need to hear that that's what you're hearing, because I certainly am not intending that. And so, it's one of those cases where you put your hand on your mouth and you say, oh dear, okay, I'll shut up for a bit. But so I want to say as well that Paul goes on in his letters, think of 1 Corinthians, making it clear that men have certain distinctives and women have certain distinctives. And we've misconstrued those, but they are different. And he addresses men as men and women as women, as when he addresses husbands and wives. Likewise, in the prison epistles, he talks about slaves and free. Not, we'll forget those distinctions. But no, you slaves, that's where you are at the moment. You have certain duties. But the point is, you are then all one in the Messiah. And then it's a matter of cashing out what it looks like that, yes, you are still a slave. Yes, you are still a man or a woman or whatever. Like for Paul, Romans 11, I am a Jew. I'm Judaios. So even though Paul has said there is no Jew or Greek, for certain purposes, he needs to remind his hearers that he actually is Jewish. So he is part of the Jewish remnant, which is then on equal footing with the Gentile remnant. You hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
Because it doesn't mean the erasure of all distinctions. It means the elimination of the theological evaluation based on those distinctions. That's the crucial point.
And then the theological, the wall that the Torah built up. And I loved your explication of, if I build up a wall and then tear it down, am I making the Messiah a sinner? I don't know how I missed that for so long, but I did. But I missed it.
Most people do, to be honest.
I've missed it no longer. The theological, once you have these changes downstream, let's look at this way. However, at that stage, you didn't know God, and so you were enslaved to beings that in their proper nature are not gods. Okay, so if in the old world, humanity is enslaved to these demons, or these things that aren't God, I think Christians would generally understand that as fallen angels or something. Even the Torah observant become, in some sense, enslaved to the powers of the world in the name of Torah. But there's a kind of that if the power of those, if the powers are broken, then eventually slavery itself must be broken.
Well, yes. And that's the point at which, of course, Christianity's critics have said, well, you took your time about it, guys. And part of the answer to that is, of course, that it was only possible, really, to eliminate slavery when Britain and America and other powers actually had their consciences pricked in the 18th century. But also, people have said rather cynically, because the Industrial Revolution was providing you with machines that would do some of the work instead. Now, I don't know how true that is. I'm not an 18th century historian, though I've dabbled. But yes, from the beginning, it was a stain on the conscience of the church, and many early Christian teachers were aware of this as a major problem. But then it's parallel to what we will look back, or Christians will look back in 100 years' time, if there is still a world and a church in 100 years' time, and say, those guys in 2021, they were still driving those cars around, which were using gasoline and which were polluting the planet and causing global warming and so on. and they knew that, and yet they still did it. How on earth could they square that with their conscience? And I say, yeah, I put my hand up. I'm not actually sure how I could run my family life without driving a car, but we hopefully will get there. So it's a loose parallel, but you see what I'm saying?
Right. Personally, I might choose a different moral affront as something future generations will look back, but we can set that aside for a moment.
Sure,
Which one will look back and say, I can't believe we did that. To speak to this issue of the economics, because that is my day job. I think that the Industrial Revolution did make the cost of slavery, the comparative advantage of slavery, higher, but there were still ideologies of resistance which went way. We held slaves far longer than it made economic sense to hold slaves. And you ever hear the story of you heard economics referred to as the dismal science, right? You've heard that phrase.
Okay.
With the background is Ruskin and Carlyle and the traditionalists calling poetry's the gay science. And economics is the dismal science, because these economists are telling us that slavery is a bad way to manage an economy, that it's better to use machines. But as Aristotle said, if there are no slaves, then there can be no poets. So the dismal science will destroy the gay science, and he blames Exeter Hall. So you've got evangelicals pushing the Industrial Revolution and anti-slavery, saying not only is it wrong, but it's inefficient. And in America, the South, even now, is economically behind the North, because slavery was not just an evil system, it was a stupid system.
A stupid system,
yes.
No, well, that's very interesting. I didn't know that, and it's why I look to people like you to enlighten me on matters on which I'm very ignorant. But yeah, no, that does make sense. But I think for Paul, it's so woven into the fabric of how Greco-Roman society worked that when he's writing to people in Turkey or Greece or wherever, there's no way he can say, by the way, you all ought to give up your slaves tomorrow. We needn't stop on this one, but I mean, it's the other thing which has to be said always when we're discussing this today is that in the ancient world, slavery had nothing whatever to do with the color of your skin. Anyone could become a slave. An emperor could become a slave. All he had to do was to lose a battle in a crucial war, and he'd be hauled off if he escaped with his life. And so the Mediterranean world was a rich mixture of different colors. So it had nothing of the connotations that 18th and 19th century slavery has for us North Atlantic folks.
Yes. Anyway. And by the way, I would take more seriously the Epicureans of today if the Epicureans of then were calling for the abolition of slavery. None of them seem to have been as far out on the edge as Paul was, in dealing with Onesimus and Philemon. So
quite exactly.
All right. So let's kind of bring this. Circumcision is clearly a central idea here. And what I think you're doing is you're breaking down the wall of division between the community and autobiography sections of Galatians early on, and the theological, soteriological divisions, say, in the middle of the book. So can you tell us more about, how those fit together? I mean, that might be too broad.
Well. I mean, this is so fascinating, and Galatians is quite unusual in that respect, in that it does have this long autobiographical section, which most letters don't. I mean, you get a bit of autobiography here and there, for instance, in 2 Corinthians, but nothing in the same order. And part of the reason for the autobiography is that the rival teachers who have been to Galatia have been telling the Galatian churches that Paul had only given them part of the true message, and that Paul himself had got his message from the Jerusalem apostles, and that they, the rival teachers, know that the Jerusalem apostles would have added this whole bit about circumcision, and therefore they're trying to say, so Paul got it wrong, he was a second-hand, second-rate apostle, and you can discount him and take it from us because we know the real guys back in Jerusalem. And so Paul has to go through. So Paul's a
messenger of Jerusalem who bungled the message. That's your mirror reading. Paul's arguments seem to be against that argument.
Exactly. But at the same time, he's building into that argument all the stuff about people wanting to compel other people to be circumcised. And unless we understand the political dynamics of that, we will translate it out into 16th century soteriology, which is quite wrong. In other words, the desire to get circumcised or to have other people get circumcised is not about, like you imagine Luther's Catholic interlocutors wanting to drag his converts back into the Catholic Church and make them good Catholic dogma observing people instead of Protestants. That's completely not what's going on here. The sociological situation, as I've described it, actually, this is something we don't often think about. But when people became Christians from a pagan background in the ancient world, the biggest change in their lives was that they stopped worshipping the gods. I mean, I don't know how much of my study you can see around me, but I've got all my household gods here, some ornaments, some little statues, some pictures, some bits and pieces, not to mention all the books. And do I worship them? Well, no, I don't. But you see the point. In an ancient pagan home, you would have little statues of the divinity, of your household gods. And then on the corner of the street, there would be a statue of a god or goddess, and then there would be the big ones in the middle of the town or city, etc. And there would be processions, there would be rituals, there would be sacrifices, and everybody was expected to join in because the gods mattered. The gods were the invisible inhabitants of the city, and if the visible ones didn't pay them proper respect, the gods would get angry, and you'd have a plague or a flood or a fire or something pretty nasty or hostile enemy action. And when that happened, people would say, oh, it's your fault because you went slack on worshipping the gods. You didn't turn up for the processions, etc. Now, that's the normal situation. When somebody becomes a Christian, they become monotheists. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, you turned from idols to serve the living and true God. And that means that your neighbors are going to say, so who wasn't there for the sacrifice yesterday?
Yeah.
Watch out, we've got your number. Bad things are going to happen and we'll know who to blame. So the Christians have to learn that they come under the Jewish exemption because the Romans, ever since Julius Caesar, 60 or 100 years before, the Jews had been given by the Romans permission that they would worship their own God and not the pagan gods. They would pray for the emperor, they would pray for Rome, but they would not pray to the emperor or to the pagan gods.
I think offer sacrifices for him, but not to him.
Exactly. And that's a major distinction. And the Jews accepted that, and basically everybody knew about it. And naturally, in a pagan city, many people looked at the Jews and thought, well, they're weird. We don't know why they won't worship the gods like maybe they're atheists,
yes,
actually.
right.
That was a regular slur. But now you've got these ex-pagans, and they are claiming the same. They're saying, we are
claiming the Jewish
Abraham.
exemption, but are they really Jews?
Exactly.
Right.
And so you can imagine the civic authorities saying to the Jewish leaders in Derbe or Lystra or Iconium or Pisidian Antioch, who are these people? They're not worshiping the gods. They say they're with you. And the Jewish leaders say, we don't know who they are. Some strange guy called Paul came into town and told us some strange story about a would-be Messiah who got crucified. And we don't know what's going on. And the civic authorities are saying, sort it out or we're coming for you, one way or another. Meanwhile, the Jerusalem church, who are under huge pressure from the non-Christian majority in Jerusalem, because they say, we hear that some of your folk out on the frontiers are fraternizing with pagans. We know what happens when people start doing that. That's what Deuteronomy warned us about, you know. So you've got this pressure on the church in Galatia. Get yourselves in line, get the men circumcised, and then we'll all heave a sigh of relief because we'll be able to say to everybody, it's all right, we're keeping Torah, so we really are Jews.
So I wonder about 612, whether it's alluding to that, in the sense that maybe they were saying, if the Christians abuse the Jewish exemption, the Jews will lose the people who want to make a fine showing in the flesh, who are trying to force you into getting circumcised for this purpose only, that they may avoid persecution for the Messiah's cross. That is precisely the point. And it's interesting that we wait till very nearly the end of the letter for Paul to drop that final brick into place, that Paul says they're not interested in actually keeping Torah.
all they want is to put on a good public display. Oh, yes, we're all fine here. We're all good Jews. So please go away and leave us alone. And Paul says, Paul, the ex-Pharisee, he knows perfectly well what genuine Torah observance looks like. He says this in chapter 5. He says they are not interested in keeping the law at all. They just that's the passage you just quoted. But in chapter 5 as well, he indicates that they're just playing around. They're just hypocrites. They're just play acting. And so once we understand the complexities of the social and cultural and particularly theological situation, this is about a community that is refusing to worship the gods, is claiming the Jewish exemption, and is getting in trouble for it. And Paul says, if that's the way you're playing the game, you are pretending that the Messiah has not died and been raised. The new age has not been inaugurated. We are still back in the old world where Jews are marked out by circumcision. And the whole point of Galatians is that the new thing has happened. This is where the so-called apocalyptic school gets it right, even though they make many other mistakes, that the new thing has happened. As a result, God's new world has been inaugurated, and the marks that you bear of that are clear right the way through, sharing the faith of Abraham, walking in the spirit and not in the flesh, and so on and so on.
There's something that you've been writing about for some time about Galatians, and obviously it's in your Galatians commentary, which I think is maybe a little startling to some people. It was to me when I first heard it. By the way, we're about half an hour in, so I'm just gonna look for cues as to when you get sick of me. The promises were made to Abraham and his seed, and then you go on essentially to explicate in your translation, that is his family. So your argument is that the single seed thing that's going on in Galatians 3 isn't a single person, the Messiah. I mean, it might be because there's a single person, then there's a single family, but it's a family. The argument here is ultimately there's one family. There's one Abrahamic family.
Yes, the word sperma, meaning seed, regularly means family, which is a collective noun. So you can talk about a single family, but of course, a family includes many people. And this is one of the classic examples where Paul uses the word Christos to mean Messiah, square brackets, and his people, like he does at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 1, when he says, is Christ divided, when they're following different teachers and so on. He says, you're cutting up the Messiah. And likewise in 1 Corinthians 12, as the body is one and has many members, so too is the Messiah. So he can see the Messiah as both the individual Jesus and as the one who sums up God's people in himself, so that what is true of him is true of them and vice versa. I first tumbled to this back when I was teaching in Montreal. I remember doing a Bible study with some folks from the church that Maggie and I were attending at the time. And we were tripping up over Galatians 3 because it seemed to be so artificial. Yes. And I was working on it anyway for scholarly reasons. And verse 16 of chapter 3 goes exactly with the very difficult verse 20, 19, 20, 21, but then particularly with verse 29. And you have to remind yourself the whole time that the argument of chapter 3 is designed to come into land at verse 29. If you belong to the Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed. And in the middle of that is the very strange and dense argument, verses 19, 20, and 21, where the law is given until the seed arrives. And the law was given through the mediator, who is Moses, but the mediator is not the mediator of the single seed. But God is one, and therefore, as in Romans 3:30, God desires the single family. God is one, and therefore he will justify Jew and Gentile the same way by faith. This is where you really do need Romans 3.
Not the mediator of the one means the one community, the one seed.
The one seed family, yes, right. Exactly.
Okay.
Because Moses has given a Torah which specifically says to the Jews, you've got to keep separate.
Yes.
So if you say that Torah is the thing that matters, you will end up with two families, a Jewish family and a Gentile family. And Paul says, but God is one, and the implication, as in Romans 3, is, and therefore he desires the single family. And that's what the rest of the passage goes on to explain.
So again, the separation of Torah was a good and valid separation, but
Yeah.
Going to Romans, the law is good.
Yeah,
We're the problem,
yes.
not the law.
Well, that's right. And the problem of Torah was the material on which it was working. That's the point of 2 Corinthians 3,
Right.
where he contrasts the effect of his ministry with the effect of Moses' ministry. And many people think Paul is contrasting himself with Moses, but he's not. He and Moses are both doing God's work, but he is able to address people who are indwelt by the Holy Spirit, whereas Moses was addressing people whose hearts were hardened, he says. And all sorts of things play out from that.
So does Torah have a kind of unexpected purpose in the sense that you can read the Tanakh or the Torah and you can get the sense that this is a permanent community? Although the blessings and cursings, there are hints at the end of Deuteronomy. Wait a minute, there's something after, but you can still go a long way before you see that. And then when the Messiah is crucified, it's almost like, oh, wait, there was a deeper purpose for the Torah, which is to reveal who we are, to reveal that no law other than the Messiah would be enough.
Yeah, well, yes,
but that's hidden to some degree, I think, isn't
absolutely.
it? It's not. There's an apocalypse in the crucifixion and resurrection. There's an apocalypse that reveals more of the purpose of the Torah.
There is indeed. I think I argued many years ago that what we get in the Gospels, among many other things, is a new hermeneutic, a new lens through which to read the Old Testament, rather like Jesus explaining the scriptures to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, that in the light of the crucified and risen Messiah, oh my goodness, now the story makes sense. Now we can see this, of course, was where it was all going, but we can also understand why we couldn't understand it before, because it only makes sense with this key. And that one of the fascinating things about Paul's theology is the enormous sense that it makes of so much. The sort of undesigned coincidence of it, if you like, is almost a theological argument for its own validation as it stands. So that the difficulty has been in the modern period that we've all lived in the shadow of Immanuel Kant with his great big ethic hanging in the sky.
Noumenal phenomena distinction, and religion is non-rational, and
absolutely.
Right.
But with ethics as this categorical imperative bearing down on us. And so we think, oh, the law is forcing me to be this and to do that. And then here comes the gospel and says, we don't need to bother about all that stuff. And that's a very modern dilution and distortion of what Paul is actually saying.
All right. So works of the law, erga ta namu, tu namu. I mean, this is what you're saying here it's going to be shocking to a lot of people, but I think a lot of scholars I think have caught up with the fact that this is not the natural law or just general goodness, that this is Torah distinctiveness, right? Works of the law.
Absolutely. And everybody in the ancient world who knew anything about Jews knew that Jews kept a lazy day once a week, that they did strange operations on their baby boys, and that they didn't eat the normal food of most people, because pork was the meat of ordinary common people. So people were puzzled that the Jews did this, and they knew that it marked them out. And we've got many texts from Greco-Roman authors as well as Jewish authors who make that very clear. These are the works of Torah. And there's a famous text in Qumran which refers to the works of Torah, which interestingly mark out one Jewish sect against the others. In other words, they are not simply trying to amass brownie points in God's final audit. They are saying, if we keep Torah this way, this will show that we really are the people whom God will vindicate when he finally acts. So the works of Torah are specific markers of a community, which then mark out that community as the ones who will know that they're the real deal as they look forward.
Maybe our own sociology is catching up with Galatians, in that a lot of commentary work is done when there's a general British consensus, there's a general American consensus. And now that we're so hyper factionalized, the Essenes, we know people who are like these groups in their own way. There's different markers. There might be MAGA hats, there might be coexist bumper stickers, but we all have our little works of the law that are different families.
Yes, that's very true. And the neighbors will notice if you don't fly the flag, as it were. I mean, we've had in Oxford the last month, the month of June was designated in Britain as Gay Pride Month. and or even just Pride Month, and flags all over the place. And if a college doesn't hang out that flag, then some of its own students will be getting onto the governing body to say, why aren't you part of this team, whatever. Now, irrespective of the issue, it's that kind of thing. What flag are you flying? What outward signs are you showing that you belong to the movement which we all think you ought to belong to now? And I don't think it's a healthy way to do politics in a democratic society,
Yes.
actually.
Western civilization, who has bewitched you? We do
Well,
feel increasingly
yes,
bewitched,
yes.
don't we?
There is a bit of that.
So there's this curse of the law material.
Yeah.
So give us a sense of what the curse of the law is. And cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. This is a verse that I've struggled with a lot. So
Well,
can you speak about that a little?
Yeah, people have often gone to that and said, there you are. Paul knew that Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified, therefore he was cursed by the law, therefore he couldn't be the Messiah. But then he discovered that God had raised Jesus from the dead, so he said, oh, therefore the law was wrong to curse him, therefore we have to do away with the law and have a different way of salvation. That is an incredible low-grade distortion of what Paul is actually saying. Paul is here retrieving the entire narrative from Deuteronomy 27 to 30. Well, 27 to 30 plus 32 gives you the covenantal story that if Israel gets everything right, then the blessings will follow. And if Israel gets everything wrong, and Deuteronomy says, which, by the way, we know is going to happen, then the curses will follow, and the worst of the curses is exile. And it's only after exile, Deuteronomy 30, that God will then transform your heart so that you will love him from your heart, and then things will go forward. And that narrative from the end of Deuteronomy is appealed to by Jews in Paul's day, like Josephus, as a long-range prophecy of how Israel's story is going to work out. It's not a bit of abstract moralism which could apply at any point in time. It's very definitely a narrative, which is then, of course, picked up in the story of the books of Samuel and Kings. This is how it plays out. This is why Israel goes into exile, and so on and so forth. So what Paul is saying is not, oh, how stupid the law was to curse Jesus, but, hey, God gave these promises to Abraham, but Abraham's family were the people to whom Deuteronomy said, watch out, because you will go under the curse, because you will commit idolatry, etc., etc. So the problem is God has made these spectacular worldwide promises to Abraham, and it looks they're all going to be dead and gone. So the Messiah, Israel's representative, comes to the point where the Torah rightly pronounces the curse and bears the curse in himself. And then verse 13 and 14 works so superbly, so that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles, and that we, that is, we Jews who believe, might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. In other words, the promises had got into a logjam because of Israel's sin, producing the curse, and the Torah was right to pronounce that curse. Jesus has come under the Torah's rightful curse on behalf of his people, so that now
all
God
right.
can bless
So
the nations
it's a
through Abraham.
rightful curse of the Torah.
Yeah.
This may seem like a very subtle distinction, but I think it's an important distinction, which is that the Torah rightly curses Jesus, as opposed to the Torah rightly curses disobedient Israel, which violates the Torah, which is a major point in Galatians. You've signed up, you got circumcised, you signed up for the whole deal, including the judgment, and that Jesus goes and occupies that point of cursing, but Jesus is not properly cursed.
No, it's he bore the curse, becoming a curse by being hanged on the tree. And you perhaps at that point need Romans 8:3 and following, where Paul says that that God condemned sin in the flesh of Christ. That Paul does not say God condemned Jesus; he says God condemned sin in the flesh of the Messiah.
Condemned or punished or something like punished. Punished sin. Is it condemned or punished? Yeah, punished.
It's condemned. It's
sorry,
katekrinen from katekrino. But it comes to no. It comes to the same thing. Because that is definitely penal and it is definitely substitutionary, but it isn't God punished Jesus, it's God punished sin in, and as you say, that's a subtle distinction. But actually, Paul knows what he's doing there, and it's important.
Well, and you're probably going to think I'm overreading this, but I can't help but notice "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree" is not a direct quote from the Septuagint. The Septuagint says "Cursed to theou" or "apu to theou" is everyone who hangs on a tree. In other words, I'm going to argue slightly here that Paul is deliberately leaving out, and it's in the middle of the Septuagint verse. It's not like he left off the end of the verse or the beginning. Right in the center, in Deuteronomy 21, we're told that it's a cursing apo to theo, so it's a curse out of God. But Jesus is hung on a tree, but he doesn't seem to, in Galatians, in Paul's interpretation of Galatians, he doesn't seem to be cursed of God. If you go back and look at the Deuteronomy passage, Jesus didn't do anything worthy of being cursed. Yeah, go ahead. Is that your Septuagint?
Yeah, it is. And you're right about 21:23. And then the other reference says 27:26. Oh no, that's just curses everyone who doesn't abide by what's written in the law, of course. Yeah, so that's right. I don't think I draw that out in the commentary, and you probably check that out, but I don't think I make that point in my commentary. Of course, this is what happens when you write a book. Somebody points out what you missed out. The book is only 400 pages long.
Well, I'm certainly not trying to point out anything you missed.
No.
Hupo theou.
Yeah, no, I've got it.
Epi eluon. So I see that as maybe a conspicuous.
Well, it might be. It might be. Except that I think for Paul, simply saying epikataratos, cursed, who is doing this curse? Excuse me. It may be a periphrastic way of referring to God, and it may be that he's just pulled back a little bit. But I would say if Paul says, Torah says, cursed is everyone who, then I think he's clearly meaning that this is God's curse. But that's a nice point which we could argue this way and that.
Right. Well, I'll hold it lightly. Let me just add, what else might it be? An inversion of what's going on in Deuteronomy, in the sense that in Deuteronomy, God curses the land. Remember, this isn't about who's on the tree. This is about the land being defiled by him being left up there. So is this an inversion in which the Eretz Israel is cursing God rather than God cursing Eretz Israel? So
I'd be careful about that.
I told you wouldn't agree, but but it's fun to talk, even to be rebutted. Okay, so we're down to the last 10 minutes. If you'll give me another,
sure, another few minutes will be all right.
All right, I'll wait I'll look for signs, Semyon, from you that. Okay, so. Just something else that kind of popped up in my mind. This isn't so much about, and I haven't finished the commentary. I'm well into it.
Oh, right.
Okay, but in 5, a little yeast works its way through the whole lump. Is this an Exodus theme here? Is he, because Exodus is key to your understanding of Galatians?
Yeah.
Is this?
Well, it's a Passover theme, obviously, because leaven is what you get rid of at Passover time. I think by this stage, this has become proverbial. Paul quotes the same thing in 1 Corinthians 5, of course. And I think if you check the rabbinic parallels, it's so widely known that this is what happens with leaven, that it could be that because Paul is thinking, but he's always thinking about Exodus. I mean, Exodus is all over the place because Exodus is the primal redemption, and Paul is talking about the ultimate redemption, so that you get Exodus overtones in many places. So I wouldn't be surprised. At the same time, where are we? That's in
that's 5:9.
5:9, because in that passage 5:7 to 12, it's very quick fire, rapid fire stuff. You were running well. Who's cut in on you? This wasn't from the one who called you. Little leaven. I'm sure that you won't think any different, but the one who's messing you up will bear his crime. This is kind of scattergun stuff, and I wouldn't want to say that the leaven, the leaven reference there must be to do with Passover. Though, as I say, Paul's got Passover in his head most of the time.
He does, right? And Jesus said, avoid the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, right? And this is the
Mm-hmm.
leaven of the Pharisees right here.
Yes, absolutely.
So people do tend to go right to homiletical or right to current or right to political too quickly. And the Messiah has to be formed in us in the sense of understanding what's being said to these people. But I would ask you to maybe build a little bit of a hermeneutical bridge in our final minutes, because we seem to be in a kind of a Galatians moment where national identity, fear of persecution, markers of in my world, it's Christian nationalism on one hand, and then it's also a progressive, something. God hates flags, versus MAGA hats, right? So there seems to be, and we seem bewitched. So I mean, how would you apply Galatians to now?
Yeah, I would say, it's funny, I didn't know you were going to ask that, but I have a quotation here which I will read out to you. I don't know if you can see that. The family, that's the church, is called to be a worship-based, spiritually renewed, multi-ethnic, gender-blind in leadership, polychrome, mutually supportive, outward-facing, culturally creative, chastity celebrating, socially responsible, fictive kinship group. That's my Pauline definition of the church. I'll send that to you if you like.
I'd love that. Yes.
I read that in an article a few weeks ago, because I think what we've seen over the last 400 years in Western society is a church that was so fixated on figuring out how people get to heaven as to ignore the message which is there in all of Paul's letters and right across the New Testament, which is the unity of the church across all traditional divisions. And for me, what Paul says in Galatians about being all one in Christ Jesus is then coming out in celebratory mode in Romans 15, 7-13, where he says, therefore, I want you with one heart and voice to glorify God, the Father of our Lord Jesus, because it's when the church is living as a single family, precisely across these divisions, that it is being a sign to the world that God in Christ has done and is doing a new thing. And as long as the church stays in its different ethnic huddles, we are a white church, a black church, a Polish church, a Spanish church, or this or whatever, as long as we're doing that, then the principalities and powers think they've won. This is part of the point of Ephesians 1-3 as well. And so my response to all the fuss about whether it's Black Lives Matter or whatever, people have said to me, Tom, how can you support that? Because it's a Marxist-inspired organization. I know Black Lives Matter itself comes out of that Marxist-inspired social, whether it calls itself progressive or whatever movement. But the point is, the church has been falling asleep on the job. We should have been out there modeling what a multicultural community cheerfully worshiping God together, what that looks like, showing people that it's possible and that if you follow Jesus, you can do it.
So these political movements become like fictive kinship groups without a Messiah to center on.
Exactly, which is almost impossible. And you can say, we want multiculturalism, but without Jesus, that's really difficult. Some societies have tried it for a while. Europe at the moment is very anxious about that as we get more and more refugees and immigrants from other parts of the world. Many European countries like Hungary and parts of France are saying, actually, we don't want that. We are ourselves, thank you very much, and we don't want all these extra people. But in America and in Britain, we have been melting pot countries. But often we've tried to do it as though it was possible without Jesus. And I think the message of Galatians is, no, it is a noble dream, but you'll only get there through that route. I, through the law, died to the law. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. That's the center of it all. And the church ought to be modeling that. And I see this, and I hope my commentary will be a word for our times in that respect.
My friend Bishop Joseph Garlington of Reconciliation International has been saying for decades, in an ethnically divided society, we can add gender divided, and we don't talk about this enough, generationally divided, because John is sent to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children to the fathers. Only the church can model unity, which probably doesn't mean imitating existing movements, but bringing this distinctively Pauline Christian approach.
a Pauline Christian approach, and of course, as I said nearly an hour ago, Revelation chapter 7, the great company which no one can number, of every kindred and nation and tribe and tongue. And this is not something for which we have to wait. This is a vision of the heavenly community right now, that this is what Jesus' people actually look like. And on the rare occasions when you see it in reality in a church building, it is a beautiful thing.
Yes.
A very powerful thing.
Os Guinness recently on this podcast said, Os Guinness on this podcast a few weeks ago said that one of the church fathers called Christians a third race, right? You've got Greeks and barbarians, a new race. And so you're not getting rid of ethnicity in some sense. I mean, you keep the old one, but the more powerful identity, the more powerful nation is incorporated into the Messiah.
Yeah, you have to be so careful how you say that. I have been criticized for using the phrase third race, etc. I think it's exactly what Paul is talking about, say at the end of 1 Corinthians 10, where he talks about being blameless before Jews and Greeks and the Church of God, the Ecclesia tou Theou, as a third entity, not Jewish, not Greek, but defined simply in terms of Jesus. I've said to people till I'm blue in the face, it's not about starting a new religion which happens to have this person called Jesus. It is all about Jesus himself. Either he is who we say he is, and in which case the whole world is different as a result, or we're all wasting our time and we ought to go away and do something more important. But for those of us who believe that Jesus really is and was Israel's Messiah and the world's true Lord, then he is the fixed point around which everything else now moves. And that's the message of Galatians.
Interesting. Did we go do something else because we ran the race in vain? And as divided as we are, one can be tempted to feel like we've run the race in vain. Is there anything else you want to add? We talked about your Galatians commentary. I want to mention N.T. Wright Online
thank you. Yes,
as a great resource.
And actually, I did some lectures on Galatians based on this commentary a few weeks ago. I did them online because I couldn't get on a plane and go to Texas as had been planned. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to shorten those lectures slightly and turn them into a new course on Galatians for N.T. Wright Online. So we did a course on Galatians 6 years ago, I think, for NTW Online.
Yes.
But this will be a new course incorporating the insights from the commentary.
Well, I look forward to it, and I think that pastors ought to be, downloading this for their churches. The fees are very modest, and there's also, you can do some bulk. You can get a whole lot of N.T. Wright.
Sure.
We live in an age where you can get the best scholarship for almost nothing. It's amazing that we spend so much time watching junk. Oh, anything you want to add? We're right at our hour. I always want to make sure that we didn't miss anything.
I think we've said most of it. It's just I do want to come back and highlight. It's partly the end of chapter 2, but then it comes again and again that actually the book is all about Jesus, and it isn't about theories of salvation. It isn't about theories of sociology. It's about Jesus and what it meant and means to belong to the community that is created by Jesus' death and resurrection. And I wouldn't want people listening to me talking about Galatians to think that Jesus was just kind of a figure who enables certain theories to become true. The theories all point back to Jesus, and he ought to be in the middle of all our discussions.
And he certainly is in the middle of this commentary, in the Messiah, incorporated into the Messiah. Jesus is the driver, and Galatians is a community was supposed to live out Jesus's idea of what his death and resurrection would do. Here's my Kindle version of it. If you're a Kindle person, Tom Wright can hold up his hardcover. I think most of my peeps are hardcover people. N.T. Wright, you always say call me Tom, so I find it a little difficult to do that, but I'll try for it. Thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for being with us again today, and for your generosity.
Thank you very much, and it's good to be face to face, albeit electronically.
And maybe in the summer at Wycliffe Hall in person.
Possibly.
Yes. For that entrepreneurial leadership program.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And welcome to today's installment of the 2022 January series. My name is Sheila Whipley, and I'm a junior from Grand Rapids, Michigan, double majoring in philosophy and history. I also serve as a worship apprentice on campus this year. Would you please take a moment to silence your cell phones? As you are doing so, I would like to welcome guests from all of our 50 simulcast viewing locations, including Bellevue, Washington, Palo Alto, California, Manistee, Michigan, and all our virtual attendees across time zones. We are grateful that you are joining us today. Now please join me in a word of prayer. God of wisdom and understanding, you have gifted us your word that we may better know you, be formed by you in truth, and love our neighbors as ourselves. Thank you for the blessing of church leaders and scholars whose knowledge and wisdom help your church to understand Scripture as you intended it to be heard. Today, we are especially grateful for N.T. Wright, and we ask that you would guide his words as he speaks to us today. May we be shaped into a flourishing, Christ-centered community who reflects the love of your Son, whose Spirit is among us. In the name of Jesus and through the power of the Spirit, amen. And now, Reverend Scott Jose, Director of the Center for Excellence in Preaching, will introduce our guest.
Good afternoon. Few, if any, theological authors or Bible commentators are quite as prolific as N.T. Wright, who has written now some 80 books. In fact, it is said that some time ago, someone placed a phone call to Tom, which was fielded by an assistant. "I'm sorry," the assistant said, "Dr. Wright can't come to the phone right now. He's writing another book." To which the caller replied, "I'll hold." But as wonderful as his body of written work is, here at Calvin University, we are so happy that today's appearance, though virtual, this lecture even so makes N.T. Wright the most frequent January series speaker of all time. Today is his 6th January series appearance, and I think that's worthy of a round of applause right there. Tom Wright is ordained in the Church of England, which he served as the Bishop of Durham from 2003 to 2010. For the next 10 years, he was professor of New Testament and early Christianity at St. Mary's College at the University of St. Andrews. He has traveled and spoken extensively around the world. And when he is not writing or speaking, in his spare time, he composes songs about the book of Genesis with the just retired head of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins. Riffing on the Beatles and Bob Dylan, the guitar-playing duo of Collins and Wright have recorded the songs Genesis, and most recently, A New World Has Been Born. It's on YouTube. Look it up. But one of Tom Wright's greatest gifts is making the Bible come alive in ways that are fresh and vibrant, which is why, as also a preacher, I'm so excited to hear today's lecture on Paul's letter to the Galatians. And as a reminder, there will be a live Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please email or tweet in your questions as usual, and Chaplain Mary Hulse will be facilitating that in a little while. The Center for Excellence in Preaching at Calvin Theological Seminary is pleased to underwrite today's presentation. Now, please join me in once more welcoming and learning about God's Word by listening to Dr. N.T. Wright.
Hello, I'm Tom Wright, speaking to you from my study in England, in Oxford, in fact. Welcome to my mess, my workplace. Paul wrote to the Romans that he'd often wanted to come and see them, but had been prevented. Well, I've wanted to come to Calvin College for this January series for a long time now, to catch up with old friends, and particularly to engage with you around my recent work. Sadly, the pandemic and the flight cancellations have kept me at home, and I'm especially grateful to those who've worked hard behind the scenes to make it possible for us to have as good a virtual experience as we can. I chose Galatians for today because my new commentary, which was published last summer, is exploring fresh approaches which I want to share more widely. Galatians has, of course, been central for Protestant Christianity ever since Martin Luther hailed it as the epistolary equivalent of his wife, Katie von Bora, Well, I don't know whether the good Katie ever gave her husband a piece of her mind, but actually Galatians itself ought to tell Brother Martin that though he got some things right, there were others where he went astray. I'm not getting into that today, but I worry that to this day, the church's reading of Galatians has flattened the letter out, like someone reducing a cube to a square or a sphere to a circle. To hear what Paul was saying in his own day and what he might say to us, we need three-dimensional readings. I assume, by the way, that anyone in a Calvin College audience already knows Galatians by heart, preferably in Greek. But if you're a tad rusty, I hope you've got access to a text to see what I'm talking about. Galatians comes in three parts: a long introduction in the first two chapters, the core of the argument in the central two chapters, and the practical application in the final two chapters. You'll find details and bibliography and scholarly discussions in the commentary. Now, many of you will know the swings and roundabouts of modern Pauline scholarship. If you don't, please refer to my 2015 book, Paul and His Recent Interpreters. The classic view saw Jewish teachers telling Galatian converts that they had to keep the Mosaic law in order to be saved. And Paul was saying, no, the law is now set aside. All you've got to do is to believe. Problem one, most Jews of Paul's day were not legalists like that. Second, this pushes Paul towards the Marcionite view, contrasting the Old Testament with the New, whereas Paul sees great continuity. Particularly third, it ignores his emphasis on Jesus' followers as the true children of Abraham. Fourth, this traditional view runs into trouble in Galatians 5 and 6, where, despite the previous emphasis against works, Paul here insists on a strict and robust Christian ethic. Fifth, the traditional view has difficulty integrating Galatians with the positive view of the law in Romans. Sixth, it ignores the meaning in Paul's world of key terms like pistis, faith, and dikaiosune, righteousness, which regularly referred to communities of fidelity and justice, not to systems of soteriology. But seventh, and most important, Galatians is not about how people get to heaven. Heaven is never mentioned. Salvation is only alluded to briefly in this letter, unlike Romans, where it's a major theme. Actually, nowhere in the New Testament does anyone suggest that going to heaven is the Christian goal. Jesus taught us to pray that God's kingdom would come on earth as in heaven. And the New Testament ends with the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth, not with saved souls going up. The early Christian vision, Paul's vision, is of new creation. You see, the Protestant reformers were doing their best to give biblical answers to medieval questions. But the problem was the medieval questions themselves. Once you think in the biblical terms of new heavens and new earth, with God's people as the resurrected royal priesthood within this new creation, everything looks different. We must stop giving 19th century answers to 16th century questions and strive to give 21st century answers to first century questions. So where do we go? You will have heard of the so-called new perspective, in which Paul's point was that you don't have to be Jewish in order to be a Christian, so that works of the law then are not good moral works, but Jewish-specific boundary markers like circumcision and food laws and the Sabbath. Now, that's okay up to a point, but this too can be a bit monochrome. I discuss in the commentary and in the book on recent Pauline scholarship other movements such as the American so-called apocalyptic school who follow J. Louis Martin. And very differently, there is a movement which now calls itself the radical new perspective, or Paul within Judaism, trying to argue that Paul remained a Torah-observant Jew and wanted other Jews to do the same, with the letters and the message of justification by faith addressed simply to Gentiles. All that is in the background, but I don't have time today to discuss it. My positive proposal, which I think outflanks all of these, is a fresh reading of the actual historical situation of Galatians, generating fresh challenges to us in our actual historical situation. So Galatians in 3 dimensions, if you like, space, time, and matter, or politics, theology, and human life. The first dimension is that Paul sees Jesus as Israel's Messiah. Through Jesus' messianic death and resurrection and the gift of the Spirit, the divine purposes set out in Israel's scriptures are fulfilled, and God's new creation is unveiled. Of course, this ultimately means salvation. Paul speaks in 5:5 about the future hope of righteousness. That's there. And he speaks in 5:21 of some people who will not inherit God's kingdom. There is a future goal, a larger framework. But Galatians isn't about how that works, how people get saved. It is about the church. Not that ecclesiology displaces soteriology, rather it's meant to embody it. If Jesus is Israel's Messiah, this is the point, Paul knows that his hearers are living in a new period of time between the messianic events and the final establishment of God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. They can live there, Jews and Gentiles alike, because on the cross God has dealt with sin. Traditional theology is contained within all this, but it isn't the main subject. You see, the central argument in chapters 3 and 4 focuses on the question, who then are the people of God? Who are the true children of Abraham? This wasn't a topic of much interest in the non-Jewish or anti-Jewish world of the Middle Ages in the 16th century, but it's vital for Paul. For him in chapter 3, the biblical story runs from Abraham past Moses and the prophets all the way to the Messiah. This certainly doesn't mean, as some have been afraid it might, a smooth progression, a steady crescendo building up to the Messiah. On the contrary, as in the decisive passage at the end of chapter 2, the Messiah's death comes as a radical break. But it is precisely the Messiah's death, not somebody else's. In other words, this is the place where Israel's story, however paradoxically, is supposed to land. And the Messiah's people are then called to be the pilot project for the new creation, which was launched with Jesus' resurrection and the gift of God's Spirit. So the letter is thus framed between the opening in chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, God has dealt with sin in order to rescue us from the present evil age, and the conclusion focused on chapter 6, verse 15, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision matters. What matters is kynektisis, new creation. Paul's point, glimpsed but then twisted out of shape by the so-called apocalyptic interpretation, is that Jesus' followers, as the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promises, must now live in and by that inaugurated new creation. They must not lapse back into the old one. So this brings us to the second and most important dimension of Galatians. What was going on? What was the problem? In the traditional view, people called the Judaizers had been teaching the Galatian converts that believing the gospel wasn't enough. They needed to do the works of the law, adding moral behavior to their faith. By the way, the word Judaizers properly refers not to Jewish people trying to make Gentiles into Jews, but to Gentiles who are trying to adopt Jewish practices. Anyway, things are more complex than we usually think. I listened recently to a radio program in which an expert on Pakistani politics was explaining all the twists and turns of the last 2 or 3 decades, including the significant difference between the Pakistani Taliban movement and the Afghani Taliban movement and their respective relations to Russia and the West and China and so on. And I suddenly thought, yes, this is actually what real life, real messy life looks like. It isn't two easily defined movements, a plus and a minus, Paul's law-free gospel on the one hand, the opponent's legal message on the other. Far too simplistic. we need to go for three dimensions: social and cultural and political, as well, of course, as theological. So, what was going on? I've argued in the commentary that Galatians was written to the churches in southern Turkey, founded by Paul in Acts 13 and 14, from the major city of Pisidian Antioch, and then eastwards to Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And again, my view is that the letter is written just before Paul and Barnabas set off from Syrian Antioch to go to the meeting in Jerusalem described in Acts 15. This view is still a minority position, but it has strong archaeological and historical support. And as I argue in the commentary, it makes much better sense exegetically. And the problem facing Paul's converts and the reason for the crisis can now be unfolded. The challenge facing any Gentile convert to Christianity is clear when Paul declares in 1 Thessalonians 1 that you turned from idols to serve a living and true God. Wait a minute, you turned from idols? That's like saying to someone in my generation, you stopped using the car, or to a millennial, you've stopped using your smartphone? Idols were everywhere. Everybody had them, everybody worshipped them. Every town or city had two sorts of inhabitants, the visible ones, the humans, and the invisible ones, the gods, and perhaps also the ancestors. The gods included the big ones, Zeus and Hera and Athene and Artemis and so on, and the local ones. And there were massive temples and wayside shrines, and indeed in-house shrines for your personal favorites. And everybody knew that if you neglected the gods, bad things were likely to happen. If there was a flood or a famine or a city fire, people would at once ask, who of their number had failed in their obligations to worship the gods, to offer appropriate sacrifices, to pray the prayers properly, to attend the annual or monthly celebrations, and so on? In a world where life was lived very much in public, with only the rich having any privacy, and even then your slaves might tell on you, everybody would know who was turning up and giving the gods their due and who wasn't. And people would often spy on their neighbors and pressurize them to come into line. This whole aspect of early Christianity, that from day one a convert was supposed to abandon the ubiquitous idols, has not been sufficiently taken on board in modern Western Christianity. We are enthralled to all sorts of idols, and because we don't normally discuss it, we don't even notice it. But this was the biggest challenge for Paul's converts, not just to break lifetime habits of mind and heart as well as of body, but because it would at once mark you out as a social misfit. Imagine today a neighborhood where every house displays a poster featuring the same political candidate, and then one house fails to display any poster, or worse, shows one with the rival candidate. There are places in my country, I couldn't possibly comment on yours, where that would invite a brick through the window. Now, multiply that effect by about 1,000, and you would get near what it would mean, that when everyone else in Antioch or Lystra or wherever is setting off to attend the procession and sacrifice in honor of the local god, one family stays at home. Everybody would know. And if a plague struck the town the next week, they'd know who to blame. That is the reality of early Christian life in the Greco-Roman world. Now, there are two extra features of Galatians which bring the situation into sharp focus. First, the newest kid on the block, the fastest growing religion of the time, was the cult of Caesar and Rome. Pisidian Antioch, right there in the heart of it all, had been redesigned as a Roman colony. The architects made it as much like Rome as they could. Indeed, it was known as New Rome. It was a striking embodiment of the Roman agenda to bring their civilization and justice, justitia and dikaiosyne, to every corner of the world. After all, Caesar was obviously the most powerful god there was, having brought peace and freedom and prosperity to the world. All empires claim that sort of thing. In an age where our distinction between politics and religion didn't exist, your allegiance to Caesar meant both worship and paying tax. And the Greek word for allegiance was pistis, faith or faithfulness. And failing to offer that allegiance meant trouble at every level. A brick through the window is a brick through the window, whether the reason is religious or political. And it wouldn't just be bricks. You might well lose your job. A wife who converted and refused to join her husband in the normal civic religion might risk divorce. A converted slave might face harsh penalties, and so on. So Caesar, the Kyrios Kosmou, the Lord of the world, took his prominent place. By the middle of the 2nd century, a pinch of incense to Caesar's statue was a test case. Polycarp, 100 years after Paul, the Bishop of Smyrna, was burnt at the stake for refusing that pinch of incense. He wasn't the only one. Now that's the first extra feature, but the second is the real crunch. The Jews were exempt from all this. The Romans had long realized that you just couldn't force Jews to worship idols. They would rather die. The Romans were pragmatic. Julius Caesar had recognized that this particular people thought that for some reason their God was the only God, so they wouldn't worship any others. But in other respects, the Jews were good citizens. They had high moral standards. They paid their taxes. So a deal was struck. The Jews would pray to their God for Rome or Caesar or for their local city and its officials, but they wouldn't pray to Caesar, and certainly not to Artemis or Aphrodite or Zeus or whoever. So the Jews had a free pass from normal pagan worship, and everybody knew it. So here's the three-dimensional, real-life, real-time issue, radically different, both from the old idea about people called Judaizers telling converts to do moral good works, and also from the rather decontextualized new perspective, where the question is simply, does a Gentile have to become a Jew to become a Christian? Imagine yourself a citizen of Lystra or Iconium. You live in a world where everybody worships the gods, because everybody does, and otherwise bad things will happen. But everybody knows that the Jews don't. It's grudgingly accepted that they do their own thing. But then quite suddenly, here is this new group based not on ethnicity, nor on social class, nor, shockingly, on gender. A ramshackle bits and pieces group, men and women, slaves and free, and even Jews and Gentiles together, and they have given up worshipping the gods. And they're meeting together in secret, something the Roman world was always very suspicious of. And they're talking about offering worship to a different Kyrios, or a different Basileus, another king. Indeed, that's about all these people have in common, allegiance to this Jesus, this Christos, this Kyrios. And when they're asked why they're not worshipping the gods, and particularly Lord Caesar, the answer is, you know the rules. We belong to Israel's Messiah. We are therefore children of Abraham, and we are therefore claiming the Jewish exemption. And with that, the fat is in the fire. For a start, it makes no sense to puzzled outsiders. In what way are these people Jews? By what right are they Abraham's offspring, whoever this Abraham was? They're ordinary people just like us, citizens of Antioch or Lystra or wherever. Anyway, they obviously aren't Jews. They don't live in that part of town. Their males aren't circumcised. They're not keeping the Jewish customs. And what is this talk about an anointed one, a Mashiach, a Christos? And did we hear that right? That this anointed one is actually the Lord of the world? Even the most generous-hearted citizens of Caesar's broad domains might shake their heads in puzzlement and anger. And word would get round. Small, tight-knit communities, everybody knows everybody else's business. Before too long, someone in authority is knocking on the door to find out what it's all about. And the more these strange, deluded people talk about Abraham and Israel and an anointed one, the sooner somebody will knock on the door of the synagogue leaders. Look, they'll say, You've lived among us peaceably. You do business with us. We don't understand you. We don't know why you don't join in our normal life, but we sort of respect you. You keep yourselves to yourselves. We've learned to live with that. But who then are these people who claim to be Abraham's children and so to be exempt from ordinary civic life and worship? The synagogue leaders will have known what was going on. Paul, after all, began his preaching in the synagogue in each place. He got an enthusiastic hearing, often from the Gentile God-fearers, the hangers-on around the edge. But the message about a crucified Messiah was too scandalous, too blasphemous for most Jews. So the synagogue leadership, faced with these questions, would try to disown this strange hybrid new grouping, not least those Jews who, despite the scandal, had been convinced that Jesus really was Israel's Messiah and had joined in with the new movement. But the leaders would do their best to discredit Paul, to portray him as a crazy maverick with a weird idea. I don't think the civic officials would be that impressed. They might suggest darkly that the synagogue leaders had better sort it all out. Otherwise, their own privileged exemption might be called into question. After all, if anyone and everyone could just stand up and announce, oh, by the way, I'm a Jew, what was to stop the system descending into chaos? Good fences make good neighbors. Clear ethnic boundaries mean we all know where we are. Paul's crazy multi-ethnic church was indeed a novelty, a new creation, and a very disturbing one. So the synagogue leaders will be thinking, we need to get those strange Gentile Jesus followers into line with synagogue discipline, at least outwardly, so we'll be able to get the pagan officials off our backs. So the synagogue leaders would put pressure on Jewish Jesus followers to persuade their strange new Gentile friends to adopt just enough Jewish custom to look good, to make a good showing in the flesh before anyone who might be interested. The men would have to get circumcised. And the Jewish community could thereby demonstrate to anyone who was interested that this new group, though unexpected, was, so to speak, kosher. That's what the agitators, the troublers, as Paul calls them, will have been saying. Now, that solution might have looked attractive from one point of view, but it generated real anger. The social and civic pressure could easily turn violent, as social pressures can still do even in our enlightened times. The instructions in Galatians 5 and 6 are not generalized ethics. They focus quite sharply on factional and social squabbling and quarreling and even violence, and people trying to play one-up games against each other. Paul speaks about biting and devouring each other. But notice what sense this all makes of his charge in chapter 6, that those who want you to be circumcised are not in fact interested in proper law keeping, either for themselves or for you. They just want to make a good showing in the flesh in order to avoid persecution. It all fits. Now, this scenario is, of course, much more complex and socio-culturally oriented than most previous readings of the letter. It's much more like real life. But if you've got your head around that, then there is a whole other dimension as well. The diaspora synagogues in South Asia are not the only worried parties. The sharpest pressure will come from Jerusalem. Paul knew. He'd lived there. He knew what the hardliners would be saying and thinking. He had been one of them, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. You see, Jews in the diaspora had mostly figured out how to live alongside their pagan neighbors with greater or lesser contact or integration. But for Jerusalem hardliners, it seemed different. Think about it. Galatians was written, I think, in the late 40s, 48 or 49, less than a decade after Caligula famously had ordered a massive statue of himself in the guise of the god Jupiter to be erected in the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple. You only had to read Daniel, very popular in the first century, to see the point. These Romans are the ultimate beast from the waters of chaos. Hardline Jews thrived on stories of pagan abomination and idolatry, and the Romans were now clearly the ultra-pagans. Of course, fortunately, Caligula died before the order could be carried out, but the Jews read the signs. There were already movements of revolt, which would soon turn into the disastrous war of the late 60s. So, if there was a crisis coming and people could see it coming, with God's loyal people fighting against the forces of darkness, it was vital for Jews everywhere to stay true to Torah, to be scrupulous in avoiding contamination from hamartoloi, Gentile sinners. Otherwise, the promised redemption, which many believed was due to arrive any day, might be delayed yet again. They'd had enough of false dawns. This time, they would stick to Torah for all it was worth and make sure as many Jews as they could would do so as well. Then God would give them the victory, the redemption, freedom, and peace. So let's be clear. The reason hardline Jews like Saul of Tarsus were zealous for Torah had nothing to do with earning moral credit to get into heaven. It was all about Israel being faithful to God in the hope that he would send his deliverance at last, on earth as in heaven. So any Jew going soft on Torah and fraternizing with Gentile sinners was how it usually began, was letting the side down. Such people had to be brought back into line. That was why 15 years earlier, Saul himself had gone off to Damascus. But now, word had got back to Jerusalem that despite their best efforts to keep their far-flung communities in line with God's will, chaos was breaking out in the diaspora, and that Saul of Tarsus, now styled Paul, was at the heart of it, encouraging people to go soft on Torah, breaking down the vital wall between God's people and those pagan sinners. So the non-Christian Jerusalem Jews, already suspicious of the local Jesus movement as being anti-temple and possibly anti-Torah, as we see in Acts, the Jerusalem Jews would turn on their Christian neighbors. These are your friends then? You're claiming to be good Jews, but actually you're in league with these people out there who are ignoring the Deuteronomic warnings about fraternizing with Gentile sinners. Put the picture together. The civic threat away in the diaspora is matched by the Jewish pressure in Jerusalem. And that is when certain people from James come to Syrian Antioch, as in Galatians 2, resulting in Peter's breaking off table fellowship with Gentiles and Paul confronting him and saying you're out of line. And it looks as though similar people, perhaps one in particular, have gone to Galatia to urge the Jesus-believing Jews there to put pressure on Gentile believers. Get your pagan friends circumcised, they're saying, or we're all in trouble. And they would add their own malign comments about Paul. Oh, he wasn't one of Jesus' original followers. And anything he knew, he got it from Peter and the others anyway. He chose the bits he liked and dropped the bits he didn't, which was probably why he and Peter fell out in Antioch. And they would say, Paul, after all, he's one of those crowd pleasers, one of those people pleasers. We've got poems about people like him. You've got to watch out for them. They trim their sails to the prevailing wind. Now, hold that picture in your head, and Galatians will come up in 3 dimensions. Only then do we understand the letter's twists and turns, the sudden stabs at shadowy opponents, the refutation of slander, and the not-so-subtle polemic against present Jerusalem. And only when we go through that exercise can we begin, as I'll suggest in a moment, to see what Galatians might mean for us today. But before that, though, there is a 3rd dimension. What was Paul's response to all this? The basic answer is, of course, the whole letter itself. But it's hard for many of us to put to one side the traditions of reading that we've known so long. That's why I've written a whole commentary. But let me summarize the key points. To begin with, go back to the same point, Paul insists at the start and finish of the letter that what matters above all is the launch of God's new creation. The death and resurrection of Jesus means that the present evil age has been decisively defeated and that all Jesus' people are set free from it. This is the strong point of the wrongly designated apocalyptic school right now. Something has happened as a result of which the world is a different place. This isn't just a scheme about how you or you can have your soul go to heaven when you die. That's not the point. The world is now a different place, and part of that difference is that Abraham is at last getting the worldwide family that God always promised him. But that new family cannot, therefore, and must not be defined by the Mosaic law. Instead, it is called to embody in advance the promised new creation. Welcome to Paul's ecclesiology. Because that's the central argument in chapters 3 and 4. God promised Abraham a worldwide family, but the Mosaic Torah would keep Jews and Gentiles separate. Therefore, if God is fulfilling his promises, the Mosaic law must now be set aside, not because it was a bad thing, now happily abolished, but because it was a good thing whose task is complete. That's such an important sentence. I'm going to say it again. The Mosaic law for Paul must be set aside, not because it was a bad thing now happily abolished, but because it was a good thing whose task is now complete. You see, Paul's critique of Torah is totally different from Luther's reading. It's nothing to do with earning merit. It's genuinely apocalyptic in the Jewish sense rather than the modern American sense. When the time had fully come, chapter 4, verse 4, God sent his Son and his Spirit to do, as he says in Romans, what Torah could not. This is a new Exodus narrative, describing how the slaves are rescued at last in order to become God's children and be given their inheritance in fulfillment of Abraham's promises. See, this isn't about comparative religion. Always a danger that the new perspective descends into comparative religion. Comparative religion which might suggest that we're looking at something called Christianity and something called Judaism, and we're trying to decide which is the better. No, this is about messianic eschatology. It's a radically Jewish argument declaring that what Israel's scriptures had promised all along has now come about. So to take on the yoke of Torah, even in one aspect like circumcision, is to say that the new age has not arrived, that God has not dealt with sin on the Messiah's cross, and that we are still in the present evil age. Paul's conclusion is stern. The passage at the end of chapter 4 about Abraham and Sarah and Hagar is the real thrust of the letter. Whoever is troubling you, persecuting you, trying to disrupt God's work must be put out of the fellowship. As in 1 Corinthians 5, the corrupting force must be stopped in its tracks. That is the challenge of Galatians. Not simply on no account get circumcised, but expel the troublemaker from your midst. All this then forms the central argument in which justification has to do with the question how you can tell in the present time who the true children of Abraham really are, and who could, therefore, genuinely claim the normal Jewish exemption. They are the sin-forgiven family, as in Galatians 2. You see, Gentiles who are technically hamartoloi, sinners, are sinners no more, because if they are in Christ, en Christo, part of the Messiah's family, well, the Messiah has dealt with sin on the cross. Thus, Paul's main positive point is that all the Messiah's people must now live in the present, in accordance with the ultimate future, that is, live as a single family. The singularity of Abraham's seed is paramount. Neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, no male and female. You are all one in anointed Jesus. If you split the church, especially along ethnic lines, then you are saying that Jesus is not Israel's Messiah, that the new age has not been inaugurated, that the old age with its human divisions is still rumbling along. Tragically, the 16th century concentration on how to get to heaven has meant that for many, many generations, this ecclesial imperative has been simply ignored. Paul's long introduction in chapters 1 and 2 paves the way perfectly for this. He carefully and skillfully answers the charges against him. And his long introduction climaxes in one of his all-time spectacular statements in 2:11-21, particularly verses 19, 20, and 21. This is Paul's own version of the Antioch confrontation between himself and Peter. You see, by separating himself from Gentile believers, Peter was effectively saying the same thing as the agitators. You Gentiles need to come into line. No common table until you get circumcised. No, says Paul, God has declared that believing Gentiles are no longer sinners. They are in the right. This is the full communal implication of justification by faith. If you, Peter, build up again the wall between Jew and Gentile, which you rightly tore down, then the very Torah you are invoking will condemn you. No, verse 19, through the Torah I died to Torah, that I might live to God. That's the line that the so-called radical new perspective can't swallow at any price. God has done the new thing he always promised, and that new thing is the representative and substitutionary death and resurrection of Israel's Messiah. So Paul declares, I am crucified with the Messiah. Nevertheless, I am alive, but it isn't me any longer. It's the Messiah living in me. The fact of the Messiah constitutes the fresh identity, either of the believing Jew or of the believing Gentile. This is the identity of all God's renewed new creation people, and Paul sees this gift of new identity, the single identity for all Jesus' people, Jew and Gentile alike, as the gift of grace, a gift which he would be spurning if for a moment he allowed Torah to become the demarcator of boundaries around God's people, as in verse 21. I do not say no to God's grace, his outpoured love. So all this is focused on that powerful, climactic, and decisive statement in verse 20. The life I live in the flesh, as Paul is still a Jew according to the flesh, but that isn't the thing that tells you who he really is. He is a Christos person, one of the anointed family. That life I live, he says, I live by means of the faithfulness of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Rhetorically, this is decisive. Paul is wearing his heart on his sleeve. He offers an unmatched combination of theology and devotion. The new status of being God's new creation people is the gift of love. In Scripture, that means covenant love. Think Deuteronomy, think Isaiah, think the Psalms. God's outpoured love for his people, Jew and Gentile alike, now instantiated in the Messiah's saving death. And with that, at the end of chapter 2, Paul's own story is complete. He's answered his critics, and he can move to the main argument in chapters 3 and 4. Now, there is no time today to explore chapters 5 and 6, but you can do that for yourselves. The key point there, though, is the charge against the local agitators, the synagogue people who are putting on the pressure, spurred on by those who've come from Jerusalem. Paul says they're not actually hardline Torah observant Jews. Paul knows very well what hardline observant Jews looks like, and he knows that they're not within a million miles of that. They just want you to get circumcised so that they can put on a good front and avoid the persecution that will otherwise come. But, he says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision matters. What matters is new creation. As in chapter 2, the world is crucified to Paul and he to the world. He bears the marks of Jesus on his body, and they may well do so too in days to come. So where does all this leave us today in our praying, our thinking, our living out of the message of Galatians? Again, 3 things very briefly because of time. First, we should be clear about eschatology and the church. The church is supposed to be a small working model of God's future. God promised to renew the whole creation. The promises of Isaiah 11 and similar texts about the whole earth being full of the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. These have been fulfilled in Jesus and are being fulfilled by the Spirit all the way until as in 1 Corinthians 15, God will be all in all. We are not promised a platonic escape to a non-physical heaven. We are assured of new heavens and new earth, and the church is called to be the advance guard of this new reality. The unity of the church, therefore, across barriers of ethnicity, class, and gender, is the necessary sign in the present of God's ultimate future world. Get the eschatology right, and it begins, of course, with Jesus' bodily resurrection, and you'll get the ecclesiology right. So this is what justification in Galatians really means. God has promised to put the whole so that they can put on a good front and avoid the persecution that will otherwise come. But, he says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision matters. What matters is new creation. As in chapter 2, the world is crucified to Paul and he to the world. He bears the marks of Jesus on his body, and they may well do so too in days to come. So where does all this leave us today in our praying, our thinking, our living out of the message of Galatians? Again, three things very briefly because of time. First, we should be clear about eschatology and the church. The church is supposed to be a small working model of God's future. God promised to renew the whole creation. The promises of Isaiah 11 and similar texts about the whole earth being full of the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. These have been fulfilled in Jesus and are being fulfilled by the Spirit all the way until, as in 1 Corinthians 15, God will be all in all. We are not promised a platonic escape to a non-physical heaven. We are assured of new heavens and new earth, and the church is called to be the advance guard of this new reality. The unity of the church, therefore, across barriers of ethnicity, class, and gender, is the necessary sign in the present of God's ultimate future world. Get the eschatology right, and it begins, of course, with Jesus' bodily resurrection, and you'll get the ecclesiology right. So this is what justification in Galatians really means. God has promised to put the whole world right in the end. And in the present time, he puts human beings right. That is, he justifies them by Jesus' death and the powerful work of the gospel. He declares that they're part of his sin-forgiven Abrahamic family. And he does this so that they can be both examples and agents of God's putting right purposes in the present time. Eschatology has been inaugurated. The church is the advance embodiment of its ultimate fulfillment. Many things follow from that, not least our commitment to justice. But this means, second, that we must recognize and reject any attempts, as in Galatia, to put social and cultural pressure on Jesus' people to conform to this or that particular civic or cultural agenda, which would make them a mere religion rather than the advance guard of new creation. We have our modern and local equivalents of the suspicions and prejudices of ancient Galatia, and politicians exploit these for their own ends. And disastrously, this divides Christian from Christian, and old unhealed divisions along ethnic or class or gender lines, quite possibly, are drawn into this. But the unity of the church is not an optional extra. I grieve over the way in which the Reformers' emphasis on faith not works led them, I think, completely accidentally to ignore Paul's urgent plea for unity. Neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, no male and female, you are all one in Messiah Jesus. The fragmentation of Jesus' followers is not only a scandal in itself, it has allowed us to be corralled into various political camps in which allegiance to this or that local shibboleth, this or that pinch of incense, to whichever Caesar it may be, counts for more than allegiance to Jesus himself. And the fact that we don't even recognize the problem usually shows how far we have slid away from Paul's vision. So third and finally, briefly but explosively, the way back is to focus on the center, which is, of course, Jesus himself, Israel's Messiah, the world's Lord. He has loved us and given himself for us to rescue us from the present evil age and to create us in him as the small working model of God's promised new creation. The warm devotion of Galatians 2:20, the devotion that has characterized evangelical piety at its best, must be reintegrated with the clear-headed understanding of what it means to be the Messiah's people in and for the world. Jesus was scandalous in his own day. Following Jesus was scandalous in Paul's day. I suspect we have hardly begun to glimpse what the real scandal of the cross might look like in the confused and dangerous world of the 2020s. But one thing I know, Paul's gospel can get us through, can find the way forward. We need to put the Jesus of Galatians in the middle and work prayerfully and sacrificially to instantiate once more the three-dimensional gospel for God's three-dimensional world. Thank you very much.
So I'd like you to welcome, as he comes up to use this microphone, Dr. N.T. Wright, the Bishop of Durham, to assure him of the warmth of our welcome to him and his wife, and to say how much we're looking forward to hearing about the historical Jesus.
Speaking as a radical, conservative, liberal, charismatic, I'm a little alarmed to hear that Alana and Rob too had a dream. I mean, I'm not sure what happens when two people have the same dream. There's something very biblical about that, I suspect. But we Anglicans have a story about the clergyman who dreamed he was preaching a sermon and woke up to find it was true. And I have this anxiety because I'm suffering from jet lag and it might just happen tonight. So if I nod off, just slip away quietly and leave me to snore. But I hope that I won't go to sleep, and I hope you won't either, because tonight's subject is, of course, very central to the whole business of Christian faith. Although that claim itself, is controversial in some circles. When I was in Jerusalem in 1989, working on an early draft of the book that became Jesus and the Victory of God, 6 or 7 years later, it took longer in gestation than I imagined. It was more like an elephant having a baby than like a human, if you see what I mean. Although actually that's an interesting point in itself when you think of the size of the book, but there we are. I was staying in St. George's College, and the Dean of St. George's Cathedral, who was my host, who's a godly, quite old-fashioned Anglo-Catholic priest, I think he wouldn't mind me saying that. He said, "What are you writing about?" And I said, "The historical Jesus." And he smiled and said, "Oh, well, I suppose, yes, that may be of interest to some people. But of course, the real thing is the Jesus that we know when we pray and when we celebrate the sacraments." And I thought, bother, he's just undermined my whole project with a neat sweep of the theological hand. But of course, it isn't only conservative Catholics who say that. Many conservative evangelicals would say it as well.